Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy Bedtime True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. On an ordinary Sunday morning in October, in the small city of Gardner, Massachusetts, the Pennington children were getting ready for church. It was the kind of routine their family had followed for years. Breakfast, nice clothes, the familiar rush of finding shoes and brushing hair before the drive into town. Their home on Cherry Street, a large old house built in the 19th century and recently bought by their parents, was full of sounds that should have been comforting. Small footsteps on the stairs, doors opening and closing, the low murmur of voices. But that morning, something was wrong. Their mother wasn't coming out of the bedroom. Their father's car was gone from the driveway. And behind the door of the main bedroom, the house was hiding a horror none of them understood yet. Brienne Breezy Pennington was 30 years old, a mother of 4, and the kind of woman whose life seemed, from the outside, to be filled with purpose. Friends and family knew her as warm and energetic, devoted to her children and to the faith community that had become a central part of her world. She had married young, built a family, and over the years moved many times with her husband Aaron, following his career and their shared plans. By the fall of 2023, they had landed in Gardner, in a big white house on Cherry Street that they were fixing up together. To neighbors, they looked like a family rebuilding a dream. For young kids, a hard-working father, a mother at home keeping everything together. But behind the walls of that house, the reality was much more fragile. Aaron Pennington, 33, was an Air Force veteran and a father who, on paper, had skills and training that should have given him a stable life. Instead, he was struggling. He suffered from serious mental health issues, including depression and suicidal thoughts, and that the marriage had grown strained under the weight of those problems. Police had been called to the home before for disturbances. The family's church contacts knew that things were not always peaceful. To those who were close to Brienne, the picture of a perfect family had long since started to crack. By October 2023, Brienne had quietly made a decision she knew could change everything. She planned to leave Massachusetts and take the children to Texas, where she hoped to start over, to be away from Aaron, as one complaint later put it. She had told people close to her that she no longer felt safe. She had contacted police and tried to seek a restraining order after Aaron suddenly returned from a trip to California earlier than she expected, a return that left her frightened and unsettled. The idea of Texas had become a lifeline, a place far from the patterns of tension and fear in the Cherry Street house. 2 days before everything collapsed, Aaron was on his phone, alone with his thoughts. On the evening of Saturday, October 21st, 2023, at 7:04 p.m., a note was typed into his phone. The note was written like instructions to himself, a script for what he would do and what he would say if his wife woke up. Don't say anything. Be quiet. If she wakes up, just say you're getting nasal spray. Get on side of bed, very close proximity to head. Put hole in her head. The words were simple and direct, stripped of emotion, like steps in a task. They described not an explosion of sudden rage, but an act planned in advance. Get close, prepare an excuse, fire at her head. It was as if he was rehearsing not only the physical movements, but the alibi, the casual explanation about nasal spray that might buy him a moment if she opened her eyes. The note would later become a central piece of evidence, a kind of digital confession written before the fact. That Saturday night in the Cherry Street house, the children went to bed with their usual expectations. Their mother would wake them in the morning, help them get dressed for church, and their father would drive them. They didn't know that somewhere in the house, or perhaps alone in his thoughts, their father had already committed, in writing, to a plan that placed their family on the edge of a precipice. Sunday, October 22nd, 2023, began quietly. In the master bedroom upstairs, Brienne lay in bed. To later observers, her posture would look like natural sleep. The house was still, the children beginning to stir in their rooms. At some point that morning, Aaron moved through the house with a gun, one belonging to Brienne, a firearm she legally owned. He went to the bedroom where his wife slept. He had already thought through what to do if she woke. The phone note suggests that he wanted to approach her on the side of the bed, close to her head, so that he could fire quickly. What happened in those final minutes between the two of them can only be reconstructed from physical evidence. The children were asleep or just waking, their rooms separated from the master bedroom by walls and doors. Neighbors did not report hearing gunfire, though later one of Brienne's relatives would say she believed the shots had woken the children. What is known is that Aaron fired multiple times. Investigators would find 3 spent shell casings on the bedroom floor and a single bullet wound to Brienne's face, or head, depending on the report. The shots were close range, directed at a woman who was lying down, unarmed and unaware. After the gunshots, there was silence, at least of the kind that can be measured from outside the room. The children eventually awoke fully and tried to make sense of what was happening. Their mother, they believed, was in bed and crying, a word later reported in their account to a neighbor. Their father was gone. His white BMW was no longer in the driveway. The oldest child, 9 years old, understood enough to know something was terribly wrong. At around 9:07 a.m., the children crossed the boundary between their home and the rest of the world. They walked to a nearby house and knocked. When the neighbor opened the door, she found 4 children, aged 2, 5, 7, and 9, on her doorstep. They told her they couldn't find their father. Their mother was, they said, in her bedroom crying, and their father's car was gone. The neighbor felt the urgency in their words. She called 911. Just before 9:20 a.m., first responders arrived at 42 Cherry Street. The house, with its historic frame and ongoing renovation work, now held a crime scene. Police entered carefully, performing what they called a protective sweep, checking each room for signs of anyone still inside, for weapons, for threats. When they reached the master bedroom upstairs, they found Brienne lying on the bed. She was on her back or side in a natural sleeping position, but the stillness was absolute. Her face showed the devastating damage of a gunshot wound. Near the bed, on the floor, were 3 empty shell casings. There were no other people in the house. The murder weapon was not in sight. At approximately 9:30 a.m., a paramedic pronounced Brienne dead. 30 years old, mother of 4, the woman who had been planning a new start in Texas was gone. Her children, in the care of neighbors and then authorities, were suddenly without both parents. One dead, the other vanished. Outside, officers began sealing off the area. The quiet of Cherry Street was replaced by the flashing lights of police vehicles and the tension that comes whenever a crime emerges in a place where people thought themselves safe. Neighbors watched from windows or porches, trying to understand what had happened inside the house that stood so close to their own lives. For the police, the immediate question was clear. Where was Aaron Pennington? Within minutes of confirming that Brienne was dead and that no one else was inside the house, suspicion turned toward the missing husband. He was not simply a person of interest. Given the circumstances, a gunshot victim in her bed, no sign of forced entry, children waking alone, a missing spouse, he became the logical focus of the investigation. Investigators moved quickly to gather information. They reviewed exterior surveillance footage from nearby properties. One neighbor's camera, trained toward the street, had captured a crucial moment. At about 8:50 a.m., a white BMW 3 Series sedan could be seen backing out of the driveway at 42 Cherry Street. There was only one person visible inside, the driver, Aaron Pennington. The children were not with him. Their mother lay upstairs, already shot or soon to be found, and Aaron was leaving alone. A statewide alert was issued for Aaron and his car. Massachusetts State Police joined the search, deploying patrol units, K-9 teams, and aerial support. In the first few hours after a homicide, time is critical. If Aaron was fleeing on roads, his car could be spotted. If he had gone on foot into the woods, his trail was still fresh. At that moment, no one knew whether he was armed, whether he might harm others, or whether he might harm himself. The day after the murder, on Monday evening, a break came from an unlikely source, a hunter. Walking through the wooded land around Camp Collier, a 500-acre Boy Scouts property about 1.5 miles from Cherry Street, he spotted a white BMW parked off a dirt track, around 1,500 feet into the trees. He notified authorities. The license plate matched the alert. It was Aaron Pennington's car. Police descended on Camp Collier. They found the car abandoned, locked or at least unattended, with no sign of its driver nearby. A large-scale manhunt began. Officers from multiple agencies swept the area on foot. Helicopters with thermal imaging scanned the forest canopy, searching for the heat signature of a human body among the trees. K-9 units followed scent trails as far as they could. For days, the woods echoed with the sound of search teams calling out Aaron's name, the thunk of rotor blades overhead, the crackle of radios. Despite the intensity of the search, no trace of Aaron was found. Worcester County District Attorney Joe Early told reporters that authorities were operating under the assumption that he was still alive and that, given his military training, he might be using survival skills to evade capture in the dense woods and surrounding areas. The head start he had gained, likely ditching his car within an hour of the murder, meant he had at least 24 hours before law enforcement began to close in. In that time, he could have traveled far on foot, or met someone, or found another means of transportation. While one arm of law enforcement focused on the manhunt, another dug into the digital and physical evidence left behind. On October 24th, investigators obtained a search warrant for Aaron's phone and began a limited extraction of its contents. That was when they found the note created at 7:04 p.m. on October 21st, the night before Brienne was killed. The one that spoke about being quiet, about pretending to get nasal spray, about getting close to her head and put hole in her head. The wording was chillingly similar to the reality discovered in the bedroom. 3 casings, a gunshot wound to her face or head, a woman apparently attacked in her sleep. The phone contained other clues. In addition to the murder script, there were searches and messages that painted the picture of a man spiraling. Criminal complaints referenced his history of mental health issues, including comments about suicidal thoughts. His relationship with Brienne had deteriorated severely in the months leading up to the murder. While he was visiting family in California earlier that year, he had sent multiple messages to Brienne, begging her to take him back, trying to repair a marriage that, in her mind, was already beyond saving. Police call logs and court documents reveal that Brienne had sought help before. On Friday, October 20th, 2 days before her death, she contacted police and asked about obtaining a restraining order after Aaron came back from California unexpectedly. She told officers she felt unsafe. To those who later read the file, it looked like a critical moment where she was trying to put distance between herself and a man whose behavior frightened her. In the end, the full legal protections she sought were never firmly in place before Sunday morning arrived. Brienne's dream of Texas figured prominently in the narrative that emerged afterward. According to family statements and complaints cited by Scripps and ABC, she planned to move there with the children, to be away from Aaron Pennington. She had talked about starting over, away from what her aunt described as erratic behavior and emotional instability. Texas represented safety and independence, a chance to raise her 4 children without the constant anxiety of living with a man whose moods could swing and whose threats she had come to fear. To those who loved her, the idea that her attempt to leave might have triggered the violence was both convincing and unbearable. Her aunt, Brenda Hull, the woman who had helped raise Brienne and was like a second mother to her, would later say in interviews that she believed Aaron waited until her niece was asleep, then approached from behind and shot her in the head. He waited till she was asleep and helpless, she said. He snuck up behind her and planted 3 bullets in the back of her head. Though medical and official accounts emphasize a facial or head wound without necessarily confirming the precise angle, The image Brenda described captured the sense of betrayal. A wife killed in the most vulnerable state, as if the intimacy of shared sleep had been twisted into an opportunity for attack. The narrative of that morning crystallized quickly. According to the criminal complaint and later reports, the sequence looked like this. At some point before 9 a.m., Aaron enters the bedroom where Brienne is sleeping and fires 3 shots at close range, striking her in the head. The sound of gunfire wakes the children. Perhaps in the confusion, they think their mother is crying. Aaron leaves the room, goes downstairs, and exits the house. At approximately 8:50 a.m., he is captured on exterior surveillance driving away alone in his white BMW. 10 to 15 minutes later, the children, realizing something is badly wrong and unable to find their father, go to the neighbor's house. By 9:19 a.m., first responders are on the scene. Brienne is pronounced dead at 9:30. The legal response came swiftly. On October 25, 2023, days after the murder, and while the manhunt continued, a murder charge was filed in Gardner District Court. An arrest warrant was issued for Aaron Pennington, accusing him of killing his wife with deliberate premeditation. Prosecutors pointed to the phone note as crucial evidence of intent. It appeared her murder was premeditated, one filing stated, referencing the explicit instructions to put hole in her head. Even as the case moved into the courts, the search on the ground shifted from a short-term emergency posture to a prolonged hunt for a fugitive. Over the next weeks and months, there were reported sightings, all unconfirmed. Posters with Aaron's face appeared in gas stations and public buildings. The state police urged anyone who saw him not to approach, describing him as potentially dangerous. He was added to wanted lists. Yet no one could say with certainty whether he was hiding in the woods, had fled the region, or was even still alive. Time passed. The seasons turned. The Cherry Street house, once a symbol of the Penningtons' fresh start, stood as a silent witness to what had happened inside. The 4 children, now placed in care away from the scene of their trauma, had to begin the impossible work of growing up with the knowledge that their mother was dead and their father accused of killing her. In the months and then years that followed, Brienne's story circulated widely. It appeared in local news, in national outlets, in true crime podcasts and documentaries. In October 2024, 1 year after the murder, Massachusetts outlets noted that Aaron was still at large. Brienne's Aunt Brenda pleaded with the public to share his image, both to help capture him and to raise awareness about domestic violence. Be on the lookout for Pennington, one headline read, summarizing the message from state police. The danger had not ended with the crime scene tape. It continued as long as the suspect remained free. By October 2025, 2 years after Brienne's death, Aaron was still missing. CBS Boston reported that the search remained active, that investigators continued to follow leads. The passage of time had not erased the arrest warrant or the murder charge. He was now a long-term fugitive, his name attached to phrases like still wanted and still at large. For those closest to her, Brienne remains more than a victim in a headline. To Brenda and other family members, she is still Breezy, the girl they helped raise, the young woman who became a mother at a young age and poured her energy into her kids. Friends remember how she loved to laugh, how she could be both strong and gentle, how fiercely she cared for her children's spiritual and emotional lives. Her death is not just an isolated act of violence, but the culmination of a long pattern of control, fear, and unaddressed danger. The Brienne Pennington case sits at the intersection of many painful realities. Domestic violence that escalated beyond what the system managed to stop in time. Mental health struggles that went untreated or insufficiently handled. And a legal process that, even after issuing a murder warrant, has been unable to bring the accused before a court. The digital note on Aaron's phone stands as a stark symbol of premeditation in an age where thoughts are often recorded, however fleetingly, in devices we carry everywhere. "Put hole in her head," he wrote. Hours later, his wife lay dead from exactly that kind of wound. In the story of that Sunday morning, one detail continues to echo. The moment, described by Brenda, when Aaron allegedly looked his 9-year-old daughter in the eye as he drove away. She stood at the house, the oldest of four, suddenly responsible for siblings in a home where their mother was already gone and their father was abandoning them to the aftermath. He looked his daughter in her eyes as he drove off, Brenda said, knowing he was leaving her responsible for 4 children with a dead mother. Whether or not anyone else witnessed that exact moment, the emotional truth it conveys is clear. The weight of what happened fell hardest on the smallest shoulders. Today, the Cherry Street house has likely changed again. Perhaps new people live there, or perhaps it sits wrapped in memory and history. The police tape is gone. The search teams have moved on to other cases. The woods around Camp Collier have grown through more seasons, leaves falling and returning, trails fading and reappearing. But for those who knew Brienne, time does not close the circle. There is still an empty place where a mother should be, and an empty line in the story where a trial and verdict should stand. When we speak of the Brienne Pennington case, it can sound clinical, like a file in a courthouse or a segment in a show. But at its heart is a woman who woke up that Sunday expecting, perhaps, an ordinary day, getting the children to church, moving another step closer to a new life in Texas, finding a way out of a marriage that had become dangerous. She never got the chance. Instead, the morning ended in a bedroom where she lay in what looked like sleep, a gunshot wound marking the boundary between the life she had lived and everything that will now never be. The story is not over. Until Aaron Pennington is found, alive in some hidden place or discovered after death in an overlooked corner of the woods or the world, Brienne's family will live with a particular kind of unfinished grief. Justice, for them, is not only a matter of courtrooms and sentences. It is also the hope that the person they believe killed Breezy will no longer exist as a shadow on the run, but as a man confronted, at last, with what he has done. Story 2. The summer evening of August 6, 2013, settled over Simpson, Pennsylvania, with the kind of warmth that made people linger on their porches and keep their windows open to catch any hint of breeze. In a modest home on a quiet street, 44-year-old Melissa Marie Rockuba and her husband Bruno returned from an evening out with friends. From the outside, their lives appeared settled and ordinary. A couple married for 25 years, parents to 2 grown daughters who had families of their own, residents of a tight-knit community where neighbors knew each other's routines and looked out for one another. Melissa had spent her younger years as a police officer, a job that required strength, courage, and the ability to read dangerous situations. At 19, she had met Bruno, who was 3 years older and serving in the Navy. They fell in love, married, and built a life that from the outside looked like everything Melissa's younger sister Joan had ever wanted for herself. Melissa loved being a wife and a mother, pouring herself into raising their daughters Chelsea and Sabrina with devotion and warmth. She was the kind of mother who made her children feel safe, who celebrated their milestones, and who later doted on her grandson Greg with fierce love. But inside the walls of the Rockuba home, there were tensions that only family members glimpsed. As the daughters grew older and moved into adulthood, they began to see cracks in their parents' marriage that had not been visible when they were children. Arguments became more frequent, voices grew louder, and there were moments when the conflict turned physical. Sabrina, the older daughter, recalled moving in with her parents temporarily with her own child, only to witness disturbing fights fueled by alcohol. One night, she saw her father grab her mother by the hair and slam her into a wall so hard that Melissa could not breathe. Sabrina knew then that she could not stay in that house, but when she tried to talk to her mother about it, Melissa downplayed the violence, unwilling to speak badly of Bruno to her children. 2 weeks before the night that would change everything, Melissa took Chelsea for a drive and shared a secret she had kept hidden. She told her younger daughter that Bruno had once pulled a gun on her when she refused to be intimate with him. It was a revelation that shocked Chelsea, who had always seen her father as someone who loved and protected them. Why was her mother telling her this now, after years of silence? Melissa's words carried a weight that Chelsea could not fully understand at the time, but they would later take on a terrible significance. "Your dad's not always who you think he is," Melissa had said, and those words hung in the air like a warning. On the evening of August 6th, Melissa and Bruno went out to dinner with another couple, Jack and Tonia Wilczewski. The four of them had been friends for some time, sharing meals and conversation in the way that couples in small communities often do. That night, according to Jack, everything seemed normal. There was no arguing, no obvious tension, just the usual rhythm of friends enjoying each other's company. But as the evening wound down and Melissa and Bruno prepared to leave, something shifted. The ride home, captured later on the couple's home security system, told a different story. The security camera mounted on the front of the Rakuba house recorded video and audio as Melissa and Bruno pulled into the driveway shortly before 10 o'clock. The footage captured the sound of an argument beginning in the car. Bruno's voice could be heard telling Melissa that next time she could get her own ride, his tone sharp with anger. Melissa responded, and the tension between them was palpable. As they moved inside the house and out of the camera's view, the argument continued. With the bedroom window open to the summer air, the microphone picked up muffled sounds of voices raised in conflict, curses exchanged, and accusations hurled. For nearly 30 minutes, the argument escalated. Melissa could be heard saying she had not done anything wrong. She told Bruno he had to leave, referencing something he had done hundreds of times before. The words were hard to make out in places, but the anger and frustration in both voices was unmistakable. Then there were sounds of objects being thrown, of movement and struggle. And then, cutting through the noise, came the sharp crack of a gunshot. The sound echoed through the house and into the night. Moments later, Chelsea Ciccio, who lived in the house next door with her young son Greg, received a frantic phone call from her father. There had been a terrible accident, he said. Her mother had been hurt. Chelsea ran from her house, her movements captured on the same security camera that had recorded her parents' arrival home. Her voice, raw with panic, could be heard screaming, "Mommy, Mommy," as she entered the house and saw what no daughter should ever have to see. Melissa was lying on the bed, a bullet wound to her head. Blood covered the floor and the side of the bed, pooling in a way that made it clear this was a catastrophic injury. Bruno was there too, clutching his left hand, which was also bleeding. He told Chelsea that he had been cleaning his gun when Melissa sat down on the bed, and it had accidentally gone off. One bullet, he said, had passed through his hand and struck Melissa in the head. It was a freak accident, he insisted, a terrible twist of fate that had injured them both. Emergency services arrived quickly. Melissa was airlifted to a trauma center, still clinging to life, while Bruno was taken to a different hospital for surgery on his hand. The bullet had left a hole straight through his palm, an injury that seemed to support his story of an accident. Family members rushed to be by Melissa's side. Her sister Joanne and their father, a police sergeant in another county, drove through the night to reach the hospital. Sabrina flew in from Wisconsin, praying the entire way that her mother would survive. Chelsea, still in shock, tried to process what she had seen and what her father had told her. Bruno's injury became a focal point for everyone around him. Who would shoot themselves through the hand? People asked. The injury seemed to prove that Bruno could not have deliberately harmed Melissa, because no one would willingly put a bullet through their own body. Family members felt horrible for Bruno, sympathizing with him as the husband who had accidentally shot his wife of 25 years. He seemed devastated, and in those first hours and days, no one wanted to believe that anything more sinister had occurred. Less than 15 hours after the shooting, with Melissa still on life support and Bruno's hand freshly bandaged, Pennsylvania State Police detectives asked Bruno to walk them through his house and explain what had happened. The scene was still marked by violence, the mattress stained with Melissa's blood, the floor splattered with evidence of trauma. Bruno sat on that blood-stained mattress and used a toy gun provided by police to demonstrate how the shooting had occurred. He explained that he had kept his loaded .40 caliber pistol in the nightstand because there had been recent break-ins in the neighborhood. That night, he said, he wanted to put the gun away safely because their grandson was coming to visit the next day. He had reached over to check if there was a round in the chamber, and that was when Melissa sat down on the bed. She leaned back toward him, and somehow the gun went off, shooting through his hand and into her head. Detectives asked if there had been any arguments or disagreements that night. Bruno said no, that everything had been fine between them. He told them they had come home holding hands, that there had been no tension at all. His story was straightforward and delivered with apparent sincerity. The next day, he agreed to take a polygraph test, though the results came back inconclusive. Worried that her father might face legal trouble, Chelsea suggested he hire an attorney. Bruno reached out to Joe Dandria, a well-known criminal defense lawyer in the area, but Dandria found that he had little work to do. The Lackawanna County District Attorney's Office reviewed the case and concluded that they did not have enough evidence to charge Bruno Roccuba with murder. Without clear proof of intent, they decided not to file any charges at all. Bruno was free to go home, free to mourn, and free to move forward with his life. Melissa remained in intensive care for 3 days, her brain too damaged to recover. Her family stood by her bedside, holding on to hope even as doctors gently explained that there was nothing more they could do. On August 10, 2013, at 1:45 in the morning, Melissa's family made the agonizing decision to take her off life support. She passed away quietly, surrounded by people who loved her. Her death certificate listed the cause of death as a gunshot wound to the head, but the manner of death was left pending, a bureaucratic acknowledgement that questions remained unanswered. In the days that followed, Bruno's behavior began to trouble those closest to Melissa. While she had been dying in the hospital, Bruno had spent very little time at her bedside. He would come for an hour, then leave, as if he could not bear to be there. When Melissa died, he was not at the hospital, he was at home. Chelsea and Sabrina, grieving and in shock, found themselves focused on comforting their father, who seemed so broken by what had happened. But then Bruno began asking his daughters to do things that struck them as strange. While Melissa was still on life support, he asked them to clean the house and get rid of the blood-stained mattress. He said he could not bear to come home to the sight of all that blood, and Chelsea, only 22 years old and desperate to help her father, agreed. She and her sister hauled the mattress into the back of a truck and burned it in the woods, destroying a piece of evidence that might have told investigators more about what had happened that night. Even before Melissa was buried, Bruno asked his daughters to help him get rid of her belongings. He wanted everything gone, he said. Her clothes, her personal items, the photographs that hung on the walls, all of it had to be removed. It's like he wanted her erased, Chelsea would later say. Melissa's sister Joanne was horrified when she realized that Bruno had donated all of Melissa's clothes to a thrift store, and she had to go there herself to find something suitable for her sister to be buried in. Bruno even got rid of Melissa's beloved Rottweiler, Zeus, a dog that Melissa had adored for 10 years. Within months, every trace of Melissa's presence in the house had been scrubbed away. Then there was the matter of Tonia Wilksuski. Not long after Melissa's death, Bruno began dating Tonia, the wife of his friend Jack, who had been with them the night of the shooting. Jack started noticing changes almost immediately. The day after Melissa was shot, Jack walked into Melissa's hospital room and found Bruno and Tonia in what looked like an embrace. They claimed they were just talking, but Jack was not convinced. In the weeks that followed, Jack would come home from work to find Bruno's car in his driveway. When he asked why Bruno was visiting so often, Tonia made him feel as though he was imagining things. Then one night, Jack woke at 2 a.m. to find Tonia gone. He drove to Bruno's house and honked the horn. Tonia came walking out with barely any clothes on, got in her car, drove back to their home, packed her belongings, and moved in with Bruno. Chelsea, still living next door to her father, watched as Tonia took over her mother's life. Tonia cut her hair to look like Melissa's. She got her nails done the way Melissa used to. She sat in Melissa's chair on the front porch and cooked in Melissa's kitchen. That first Christmas after Melissa's death, Chelsea looked out her window and saw Tonia preparing Christmas dinner in what had been her mother's home. She had not been invited. The sight was painful and surreal, but Chelsea tried to accept it because she did not want her father to be alone. Joanne and others in the family began to suspect that Bruno and Tonia had been having an affair before Melissa's death. Bruno had asked Melissa's best friend how long he should wait before publicly dating someone. a question that seemed shockingly inappropriate so soon after his wife's death. The friend had been stunned, unable to believe he was serious. Tonia later sent a text message to a reporter denying that there had been an affair, but the timing and circumstances left many people unconvinced. About a year and a half after Melissa's death, Chelsea finally confronted her father directly about what had happened that night. His answer shattered any remaining doubts she had been holding on to. "I didn't mean to kill her," Bruno said. "I just tried to scare her." The words hung in the air for a moment before he turned and walked out of the room, carrying groceries from the car as if he had not just confessed to pointing a gun at his wife with intent. Chelsea knew then that her father had held a gun to her mother on purpose, and she could never look at him the same way again. Chelsea spent months agonizing over what to do with this information. When she finally told her father that she was going to report their conversation to the police, Bruno threatened her. He said that if she went to the authorities, he would ruin her credibility, and no one would believe her. Despite his threats, Chelsea went to the state police barracks and filed a report. She told them about her father's confession and about the incident her mother had shared before her death, when Bruno had threatened Melissa with a gun for refusing to be intimate with him. But the investigator she spoke with suggested that her coming forward might be motivated by money, and nothing came of her report. Chelsea was told it was her word against her father's, and the case remained closed. What Chelsea did not know at the time was that Bruno had manipulated both her and her sister into signing away their rights to their mother's estate. Melissa had left behind a will and over $300,000, meant to be divided among her husband and daughters. Bruno sent paperwork to his daughters asking them to sign documents giving him complete control of the money. Sabrina signed without reading the papers, trusting her father even as he manipulated her into feeling guilty. Chelsea, still in shock from her mother's death, signed as well, not fully understanding what she was giving up. Bruno took the money that was supposed to go to his daughters and his grandson, adding financial betrayal to the emotional devastation he had already caused. For years, it seemed as though Bruno Rakuba had gotten away with murder. The case remained officially open, but no charges had been filed, and life moved on. Chelsea tried to let go of her anger for the sake of her son Greg, who adored his grandfather. She hated Bruno for taking her mother from her, but she loved the way he treated her boy. It was complicated and painful, a tangle of emotions that could not be easily resolved. Then, in 2020, 7 years after Melissa's death, Pennsylvania State Police investigators Corporal Greg Allen and Corporal Dan Nyland were assigned to review open homicide cases. The Rakuba case caught Allen's attention immediately. What stood out to him was the original 911 call. On that call, when the operator asked if Melissa's injury was self-inflicted, Bruno had said, "No, we were fighting." Then he quickly changed his story, saying they had been playing around with the gun, and that it had gone off accidentally. A few moments later, he changed his story again, saying they were planning to go shooting, and he had let it go off. 3 different accounts in a single phone call seemed like more than just confusion or panic. It was a series of red flags that demanded closer examination. Allen and Nyland reviewed the videotape of Bruno's walkthrough with detectives the day after the shooting. They watched him sit on the blood-stained mattress and demonstrate how the gun had supposedly gone off. But as they studied his account, they noticed problems. Bruno said he had been checking the chamber to see if there was a round in the gun, but any experienced gun owner knows that the first step in clearing a weapon is to drop the magazine. Bruno had not done that. The gun also had 2 safeties, including a grip safety and a trigger safety, both of which had to be engaged for the weapon to fire. It was not the kind of gun that went off accidentally. Bruno had demonstrated pointing the gun to the left side of the bed, away from where he was sitting. But the blood spatter and ballistics evidence were on the wall behind Bruno, not on the opposite side. The physical evidence did not match his story, and Allen and Nyland knew they needed to dig deeper. Then Nyland made a discovery that would change everything. He found that a home security system had been in place at the Rakuba house, and that the DVR had recorded video and audio from the night of the shooting. The original investigators had noted the existence of the recording, but had not had the technology to review it properly. Nyland did. He sat in the police office with the door closed and headphones on, the refrigerator unplugged to eliminate background noise, listening to the final moments of Melissa Rakiba's life. What he heard confirmed their suspicions. The recording captured Melissa and Bruno arriving home from their night out, arguing in the driveway. Bruno's voice was harsh, telling Melissa to get her own ride next time. Once inside the house, the argument continued, picked up by the open bedroom window. For nearly 30 minutes, the couple could be heard cursing at each other, calling each other names, their voices rising in anger. Melissa shouted that she had not done anything wrong. She told Bruno he had to leave. The sounds of objects being thrown could be heard, and then, unmistakably, a gunshot. The investigators sent the audio to the FBI crime lab for enhancement. When the enhanced version came back, it was even clearer. The couple had been fighting right up until the moment the gun went off. This was not an accident. This was a violent confrontation that had ended in death. The recording also captured something else, Chelsea's voice, screaming for her mother after Bruno called her over, and Bruno's response when she asked him why it had happened. On the tape, Bruno told Chelsea that Melissa had wanted to take the gun out and play, implying that his wife had been the one holding the weapon. It was yet another version of his story, and it contradicted everything he had told the police. Forensic expert Dr. Wayne Ross was brought in to analyze the blood spatter evidence. His conclusion was damning. The pattern of blood on the wall behind Bruno indicated that he had been standing over Melissa, likely in the middle of the bed, facing the headboard. Melissa had been lying on the bed, and Bruno had been holding her down with his hand while threatening her with the gun. There had been a struggle, and during that struggle, the gun went off, the bullet passing through Bruno's hand and striking Melissa in the head. It was not an accident. It was murder. On June 3, 2022, nearly 9 years after Melissa's death, Bruno Rakiba was arrested. Pennsylvania State Police troopers followed him on his way to work and pulled him over in a traffic stop. They asked if he had any guns on him, then ordered him to put his hands behind his back. Bruno was charged with murder and with theft, for the money prosecutors said he had taken from his daughters. He immediately asked for his lawyer. The case moved slowly through the legal system. As Bruno's trial approached in May 2024, his defense attorney Joe Dandria knew he faced significant challenges. The enhanced audio of Melissa's final moments was devastating. The changing stories Bruno had told were all on tape. The evidence of the argument directly contradicted Bruno's claims that they had been getting along fine, and the forensic analysis of the blood spatter left little doubt about what had really happened in that bedroom. Dandria focused his defense on the injury to Bruno's hand, arguing that no one would deliberately shoot themselves through the palm to kill someone else. But as the trial date neared, both sides agreed to a plea deal. Bruno Rakiba pleaded guilty to third-degree murder, acknowledging that his actions had been reckless and had caused Melissa's death, though stopping short of admitting that he had intended to kill her. The theft charge was dropped. On January 8, 2025, Bruno was sentenced to 12 to 40 years in prison. With time already served, he would be eligible for parole beginning in 2035. At the sentencing hearing, Joan stood and read a victim impact statement, looking Bruno in the eye and making him see her, knowing that her resemblance to her sister must have felt like seeing a ghost. She told him that he had never shown an ounce of remorse. She spoke about what he had done to his daughters, killing their mother, and then trying to erase her existence. She promised that every time he came up for parole, she would be there to protest it. Chelsea and Sabrina were left with complicated feelings. They had gotten justice for their mother, but they had also lost their father. Chelsea's son Greg had lost his grandfather, the man who had been so good to him, and that loss was hard for a young boy to understand. Chelsea struggled with the knowledge that in seeking justice for her mother, she had caused pain for her son. Then in March 2025, just weeks after the sentencing, tragedy struck the family again. Chelsea's son Greg, only 13 years old, was riding his all-terrain vehicle when he collided with an SUV and was killed. The family that had already endured so much loss now faced another devastating blow. Joanne, reflecting on everything that had happened, said it felt like something out of a book or a television show, not something that should be their real life. Melissa Marie Rakuba's story is one of a woman who tried to hold her family together, who downplayed the violence she endured, and who finally, in the last weeks of her life, began to speak the truth about the man she had been married to for 25 years. It is a story about how easily someone can hide behind a plausible explanation and a self-inflicted injury, and how long it can take for the truth to emerge when the evidence is overlooked or dismissed. It is also a story about the power of a voice captured on a recording, speaking from beyond the grave, ensuring that justice could finally be served even when the person who could testify was no longer alive to do so. Story 3. On the morning of Saturday, September 23, 2023, the village of Plain in the Bar-Inn still carried the softness of early autumn. Mist clung to the slopes of the Vosges, fields shone with dew, and the houses scattered along the valley seemed half asleep. It was a place where time moved slowly, where the mountains formed a protective barrier against the noise of the wider world. In one of those houses, a 15-year-old girl named Lena was getting ready to leave. She straightened her clothes, checked her phone, and stepped out into a day that should have been utterly ordinary. A short walk, a train, a reunion with the boy she loved in Strasbourg. She closed the door behind her and began the 3-kilometer walk toward the small station of Saint-Blaise-la-Roche. She would never arrive. Lena was not the sort of teenager to draw attention to herself. She had the normal concerns of a 15-year-old: school, friends, music, messages exchanged late at night, and the bright intensity of someone at the edge between childhood and adulthood. Those who knew her described a girl who enjoyed life in her quiet village, but who also dreamed of bigger cities and wider horizons. Her mother, Fanny, raised her in Plain, a community set in a narrow valley at the foot of the Vosges Mountains, where dense forests rise steeply behind clusters of houses, and the roads snake along the river and through the trees. That morning, Lena dressed carefully. She wore clothes her friends would later recall from photos shared on social media. Casual but neat, an outfit chosen to feel confident and comfortable. She was going to see her boyfriend in Strasbourg, a larger city about an hour away by train. The plan was simple: walk from her home to the tiny station at Saint-Blaise-la-Roche, catch the late morning train, and meet him at the other end. She left home around 11 a.m., smartphone in hand, the same road she knew so well stretching out in front of her. The path from Lena's house to the station followed the departmental road D350, a narrow route threading through the valley between Plain and Saint-Blaise-la-Roche. On one side rose wooded slopes, on the other fields, hedges, and occasional houses. There were no crowds, no busy crossroads. It was the kind of route people considered safe precisely because it was familiar, a path used by locals walking or cycling between villages. Lena had walked parts of it many times before. On that Saturday, she moved along the roadside with the unconcern of habit, texting as she walked, eyes occasionally lifting to the curves of the road ahead. At 11:22 a.m., Lena's phone registered its last activity along that road. After that, it fell silent. No more messages were sent, no calls made or received. For the mobile network, she simply ceased to exist at that precise stretch of the D350. Somewhere between her home and the small platform of Saint-Blaise-la-Roche, in a window of minutes, an invisible line had been crossed. The boy waiting for her in Strasbourg watched passengers step off the train she was meant to take. She was not among them. When she did not answer his messages, worry began to stir. Soon it would grow into something much darker. At first, the people in her life tried to find ordinary explanations. Maybe she had missed the train and decided to take a later one. Perhaps her phone battery had died, or she had bumped into someone she knew and changed her plans. But hours passed, and there was still no sign of her. Fanny tried to call, then called again. Friends reached out through messaging apps, seeing the same unanswered ticks. The boy in Strasbourg checked the time, sent another message, and began to realize that something was wrong. By late afternoon, the uneasy feeling had turned into alarm. Lena was not the type to disappear without a word. On that same day, her disappearance was reported to the authorities. The gendarmerie in the area recognized immediately that this was not a routine teenage absence. Lena was described as a reliable girl with no history of running away. She had been on her way to a known destination, along a known route, and simply vanished in broad daylight on a Saturday morning. An investigation was opened for a worrying disappearance. Gendarmes were dispatched to search the area. The search effort around Plain and Saint-Blaise-la-Roche grew rapidly. Gendarmes walked the D350, eyes scanning ditches, embankments, and the edges of the forest. Helicopters equipped with thermal cameras circled overhead, searching for any trace of a human body in the undergrowth. Divers and specialized teams examined nearby bodies of water. Drones buzzed above treetops, sending back images of fields and woodland. Volunteer residents joined in, forming human chains to comb through areas near the road, calling her name into the quiet spaces between trees. The valley, usually peaceful, filled with the sound of engines, rotors, and anxious voices. 2 days after Lena disappeared, on Monday, September 25th, an official appeal for witnesses was launched. The authorities released her physical description: 15 years old, slim, with light hair, and the clothes she had been wearing when she left home. The appeal was broadcast in local and national media. Photos of her appeared on news sites and social networks. People across France saw the face of a girl they had never met, smiling at the camera in happier moments. Alongside those images came the chilling facts. She had left home to walk 3 kilometers to the station, and somewhere along that road she had vanished without a trace. As days passed with no breakthrough, the investigation deepened. Gendarmes returned again and again to the D350, focusing on the area where Lena's phone had last been located. They knocked on doors in Plain, Saint-Blaise-la-Roche, and neighboring hamlets, asking residents if they had seen anything unusual that morning. A car stopped by the roadside, a girl walking, raised voices, any detail that might matter. They examined surveillance cameras from homes and businesses along the route and in surrounding villages, looking for Lena or for vehicles whose presence at that time could not easily be explained. At the same time, investigators began tracing phone records and digital footprints, trying to reconstruct her last known movements minute by minute. They confirmed that Lena had never boarded the train at Saint-Blaise-la-Roche. She had not passed under any of the cameras at the station, and no passengers recalled seeing her on the platform. The conclusion was unavoidable. Whatever had happened to her had taken place before she reached the station, likely somewhere along the D350, in a small window around 11 a.m. As the first week of searching came to an end, tension pressed down on the valley. Posters bearing Lena's face appeared on walls, shop windows, and lamp posts. People avoided walking alone on the D350. Parents watched their children more closely, listening for distant sirens at night. Reporters arrived, cameras and microphones in hand, trying to make sense of the mystery for viewers who now knew the name of a village they had never heard of before. For the first time, Lena's disappearance moved from a local shock to a national story. On September 29th, the gendarmerie conducted what they described as a coordinated operation of scale, focusing on several key points within the potential disappearance zone. The Section de Recherches of Strasbourg and the Barin Gendarmerie Group led the operation. They examined multiple vehicles, performed technical and scientific analyses, and continued to search in and around the villages along the valley. Yet at the end of the day, the officer in charge had to deliver the same dispiriting conclusion. No trace or clue had been discovered that day. The investigators did not exclude any hypothesis. Was this a voluntary departure, a runaway fueled by teenage conflict or secret plans? An accident, perhaps a fall into a hidden ravine or a body of water? A bad encounter with a stranger? An abduction by someone passing through, or by someone known to her? Lena was not known to have run away before, the prosecutor of Saverne noted. Nothing in her profile suggested a planned disappearance. Her mother, Fanny, insisted again and again that her daughter would not simply leave without a word, that something had been done to her. On October 1st, the Savern prosecutor announced that the case was moving into a criminal phase. The initial investigation for disappearance was replaced by a judicial investigation for kidnapping and sequestration, not followed by voluntary release for more than 7 days. 2 investigating judges in Strasbourg were appointed to oversee the case. The change of qualification was more than legal language. It was an official recognition that Lena's disappearance was now treated as a crime. The judicial investigation dug into every aspect of Lena's life. Her relationships, her friendships, her use of social media. Nothing was considered too small to examine. Her boyfriend in Strasbourg was questioned, his timeline checked against train records and phone data. So were her close friends and relatives. Investigators were acutely aware of the dangers of jumping to conclusions, particularly under the glare of intense media attention. They proceeded methodically, verifying every testimony, cross-checking accounts, and quietly ruling out people as suspects. Among the witnesses was an elderly man in his 80s who lived near the route Lena had taken. He told reporters from TF1 that on the day she disappeared, he had seen a car resembling a blue or dark gray Renault Clio in which, he believed, Lena was sitting. He described a girl in a light-colored puffer jacket, matching the description of the coat Lena had been wearing. According to him, the girl had made a gesture toward him, as if in distress. His account, though never confirmed publicly in every detail by investigators, added another layer of unease to the story. The image of a girl in a car, passing by someone who could not help her. Months went by. The leaves in the Vosges turned red and gold, then fell. Winter came, and with it snow that softened the contours of the valley and erased traces from the ground. Search operations returned in waves. New sweeps of the forests, renewed examinations of streams and ponds, fresh appeals for information. Each time, the visible activity brought a brief rush of hope, followed by the emptiness of yet another negative result. 7 months after Lena's disappearance, in April 2024, RTL noted that the investigation was progressing with difficulty, no decisive breakthrough in sight. And yet, in the background, work continued. In July 2024, investigators turned their attention to a man whose name had begun to appear in their files. A 40-something drifter with documented psychological problems named Samuel Gonin. He had been moving across eastern France and into Germany, living at the margins, known to authorities not for crimes of violence against minors, but for other offenses and episodes that marked him as unstable. His story intersected with Lena's disappearance in a way no one had anticipated. On August 24, 2024, in Fribourg, Germany, a Ford car was reported stolen. Weeks later, French investigators would learn that this vehicle, once recovered, was crucial to Lena's case. According to TF1 and other media, records from the Ford's onboard multimedia system showed that on September 23, 2023, the day Lena disappeared, the car had been precisely in the area of the D350 at the time when Lena vanished. The vehicle's path, logged by its electronics, overlapped with the last known position of Lena's phone. The man driving the stolen Ford on that day, investigators later concluded, was Samuel Gonin. Video from a service station in Germany showed him on the same date, September 23rd, stealing fuel. 2 hours later, Lena left her home to walk toward the station. The timelines began to intertwine. A stolen car, a man on the move, a girl disappearing in a valley along a lonely road. By July 2024, however, Samuel Gonin could no longer be questioned. On July 10th, he killed himself in Besançon, the day before he was due to appear in court for another case unrelated to Lena. He left behind writings, but they contained no explicit reference to the missing girl. When his name surfaced in connection with Lena, he was already dead. The investigation had lost the one person who might have given direct answers. Despite his death, the Ford remained, sitting in an impound lot. Forensic experts began to examine it in detail. On July 26, 2024, the Strasbourg prosecutor announced what he called a major advance. Lena's genetic profile had been found in the vehicle. Her DNA was inside the stolen Ford that had traveled through the zone of her disappearance at the moment she vanished. This discovery shifted the case into even sharper focus. The car, now firmly linked both to Lena and to Ganin, became a central piece of evidence. Investigators took apart its interior, testing seat fabric, floors, hidden spaces, the trunk. In mid-September 2024, acting Strasbourg prosecutor Alexander Chevrier delivered another grim update. The DNA of both Lena and of Ganin had been found on ropes stored in the car's trunk. The presence of both profiles on those ropes, he said, tended to demonstrate that at some point Lena had been tied up. In the glove compartment, they found her handbag. A year after Lena's disappearance, the story had changed. No longer just a vanishing without a trace, it now pointed to abduction, restraint, and a stolen car driven by a disturbed man who had avoided justice by taking his own life. But Lena herself was still missing. The valley where she had last been seen had been searched and researched, the roads and paths across eastern France examined. Where could she be? On October 16, 2024, more than a year after the morning she walked down the D350, an answer finally emerged far from the Bas-Rhin. In a wooded, isolated area near Sermoise-sur-Loire, in the Nièvre department, south of Nevers and more than 400 kilometers from Plain, searchers found a body immersed in a stream below an embankment. It lay in a secluded stretch of water beneath a slope, in a place not easily visible from the road. Authorities from Strasbourg were alerted, and forensic teams from the National Gendarmery's Research Institute moved quickly. The body, badly decomposed, was subjected to urgent genetic testing. Within hours, prosecutors confirmed the news that Lena's family had dreaded and, in a way, anticipated. The remains were those of Lena. The girl who had walked out of her home in the Vosges one September morning had been found over a year later in a distant wood, in another region, her life reduced to forensic data and a location on a map. For Fanny, the months between her daughter's disappearance and the discovery of her body had been a suspended time, a year of anguish lived in the shadow of possibility. She had given interviews, organized searches, and insisted, even when the investigation seemed to stall, that Lena had been taken, that this was no runaway. When confirmation came that Lena had been found dead, it brought an end to the waiting but not to the pain. There would now be a grave, a place to visit, but no more hope that Lena might walk through the door again. In the months before the discovery, French media had tried to piece together the fragments of what was known about the main suspect, even though, formally, the case had been opened against persons unknown. Reports described a man in his 40s, cut off from ordinary life, with a history of psychological problems and a pattern of drifting. He had driven a stolen car across borders, stolen fuel, lived transiently, and then killed himself on the eve of a court appearance. The picture that emerged was of someone on a chaotic path, now posthumously linked by science to a 15-year-old girl who wanted to catch a train to see her boyfriend. The broader public watched the case with a mixture of horror and helplessness. In the early weeks after Lena's disappearance, speculation had swirled online. Theories about local residents, about friends, about dark networks. The lack of information had created a vacuum that rumors rushed to fill. But the slow, careful progress of the investigation, constrained by judicial secrecy, told a different story. One of patient forensic work, of electronic traces, of small details pieced together over months. The discovery of Lena's DNA in the Ford, the ropes with both profiles, the car's presence at the right place and time. These were not products of speculation. They were pieces of a puzzle assembled bit by bit. Even with Lena's body found and a primary suspect identified, some questions remained unanswered. The exact sequence of events on that road in September 2023, the words spoken in those last minutes, the way she was persuaded or forced into the car, these could not be reconstructed fully without the man who had driven the Ford. His suicide had closed off that path. The writings he left behind, according to the prosecutor, contained no explicit references to Lena. If he had chosen to confess in his own hand, he had not done so plainly. The geography of the case, too, carried its own cruel logic. Lena disappeared in a narrow valley in the Bas-Rhin, near the Vosges. Her body was found in the Nièvre, hundreds of kilometers away, in a different landscape, beneath different trees. The car that connected those points had passed through multiple regions, crossing frontiers both literal and invisible. It suggested a long drive, perhaps at night, a body transported away from the place of abduction to a distant location that seemed, to the driver, safe enough to hide it. For the villagers of Plain and St. Blaise-la-Roche, the road along the D350 will never look the same again. The same soft bends are there, the same hedges and slopes, the same sound of the river and occasional car passing by. But the space now holds a memory that cannot be erased. A girl walking alone on a Saturday morning, a stolen car approaching, a moment when two trajectories intersected and one life was irretrievably altered. In the months after Lena's body was found, French outlets looked back over the chronology of the case. They highlighted key moments: September 23, 2023, Lena's disappearance; October 1, 2023, the opening of a criminal investigation; July 2024, the suicide of the main suspect; late July, the discovery of her DNA in the Ford; September 19, 2024, the confirmation that both her DNA and the suspects were on ropes in the trunk; and finally October 16, 2024, the discovery and identification of her body. Each date marked another step away from the initial uncertainty and closer to the stark outline of what had happened. Yet behind those dates, there is the quieter story of a family and a community trying to live with what they have learned. For Fanny, every mention of Lena's name in a news report is both a reminder that her daughter is not forgotten and a reopening of the wound. For Lena's friends, the absence remains present in small daily details: an empty place at a table, a chat thread that ended abruptly, plans that will never be fulfilled. The Lena disappearance case in France is not a story of a complex conspiracy, nor of a long-known predator tracked step by step. It is, as far as the evidence now shows, the story of a random, catastrophic intersection between the life of a 15-year-old girl and a troubled man who crossed her path in a stolen car. It is a story of how quickly safety can dissolve, even on a familiar road in daylight, and of how long it can take to find answers once a crime has been committed. It is also a story of persistence, of gendarmes who return to the same files, the same traces, again and again, of forensic scientists reading data from a car's digital memory, of a mother who refused to accept the idea that her daughter had simply run away, of journalists who months and then a year later still asked, where does the investigation stand? The Valley of Plain has gone through more seasons since Lena last walked down the D350. Leaves have fallen and returned, snow has come and gone. The world has moved on to other headlines, other cases, other names. Yet in that corner of the bar inn, and in the hearts of those who loved her, the image remains. A girl closing her front door behind her, starting down a road she thought she knew, walking toward a train and a future that should have been hers. Somewhere along that road, unseen by anyone who could stop it, the story turned. What followed was a year of searching, and then the quiet confirmation of what many had already feared: Lena would not be coming home. Story 4. On a humid September morning in 2022, in a quiet aviation community near Ocala, Florida, the house at Leeward Air Ranch looked as unremarkable as any other on the winding streets that bordered the runway. Planes sometimes taxied by just beyond back fences, and neighbors knew one another by the hum of engines and the shared love of open sky. Inside one of those homes, 74-year-old Richard Langer sat at a computer, his wife, Sally, nearby. Their adult daughter, 33-year-old Christina and Adams, lived just a few steps away in a converted studio apartment on their property. The arrangement had once seemed practical, even comforting. Parents and daughter close but separate, familiar faces just across the yard. On September 16, 2022, that closeness would become the very thing that nearly destroyed them all. Christina had not always lived in that small studio. Like many women her age, she had moved from place to place over the years, carried by relationships, jobs, and financial difficulties. By 2022, though, she had returned to her parents' orbit, living on their property in the hope of rebuilding her life. To outsiders, it might have looked like a temporary stop, time to find stability, to figure out a next step. But inside the house and the studio, tension had been building. Bills piled up. Expectations clashed. The simple question of how long Christina would stay there hovered over conversations, unspoken or half-spoken, like a storm that hadn't quite broken. Richard and Sally were at an age when most parents try to enjoy the quieter rhythm of later life. They had their home, their routines, and a vision of their remaining years that did not include constant conflict. Their decision to let Christina live on their property was part love, part duty, part hope. They had brought her into the world, raised her, and now, when she was in her 30s and struggling, they opened the door again. They believed, or wanted to believe, that proximity would give her a chance to regain her footing. But the arrangement was not working. In the months leading up to September, Richard and Sally had begun to talk more seriously about boundaries. Christina's presence on the property was meant to be temporary. At some point, they told themselves she would need to move out, to find her own place and responsibilities. These conversations came with all the complicated emotions any parent feels when telling a grown child it is time to go. They did not know that this decision, so ordinary on its surface, would be the trigger for a level of violence they could not imagine. On the morning of September 16th, the tension finally surfaced in clear terms. Sometime that day, Richard and Sally told Christina directly that she would have to move out of the studio. Sources would later say it was to make room for another sibling, but whatever the specific reason, the message was simple. It was time for her to leave. To her parents, it was likely a painful but necessary step. To Christina, it was something else entirely. But inside Christina, something raw and furious snapped that it was as if all the resentment, insecurity, and fear she had been carrying crystallized into a single thought. They were rejecting her, pushing her away, choosing someone else over their own daughter. That interpretation, fed by whatever was darkening her thinking, began to govern her actions. But Christina did not react immediately in front of her parents. She left the house and went back to her studio apartment. There, in that small space, alone with her thoughts, she began to prepare. She changed her clothes, choosing dark clothing. She put on gloves. She covered her shoes. She armed herself not with whatever was close at hand, but with specific tools she had decided to use. A 9-inch knife and a taser pen, a discreet device that could deliver an electric shock. This was not a spontaneous swipe in the heat of an argument. Step by step, she was getting ready. She remembered nodding when her parents told her to leave, then going back to the studio and, in her words, getting prepared. She put on the gloves and shoe covers deliberately, to avoid leaving evidence. She took the knife and the taser pen and walked the short distance from her apartment back to the main house. The familiarity of the path, grass, a door she had opened 1,000 times as a child, clashed violently with the intentions she was carrying now. Inside, Richard sat at the computer, unaware that the daughter he had raised and tried to help was about to turn on him. Christina came up behind him. She used the taser pen first, shocking him from behind to incapacitate him. As he reacted in confusion and pain, she drew the knife and began to stab. She drove the blade into his body at least 3 times, later evidence showing that he suffered 7 stab wounds in total, 2 of which pierced his heart and caused catastrophic damage. The attack was swift, brutal, and silent in the sense that no one outside the house knew yet what was happening. In another part of the house, Sally heard something, movement, a disturbance, and came to investigate. She entered the room and saw her husband injured, her daughter armed and attacking. Before she could fully process the scene, Christina turned on her as well. The knife that had already gone into Richard now drove into Sally's chest. She would later be found with multiple stab wounds, unconscious and breathing shallowly. In those moments, the house that had held family holidays and ordinary evenings became a blood-slicked landscape of horror. Christina believed both of her parents were dead when she stopped stabbing. She did not call for help. She did not drop the knife and fall to her knees in shock. Instead, she moved into a new phase, one that showed how far ahead her planning had gone. She took the knife and placed it in a bucket filled with bleach and water, trying to wash away any trace of blood or DNA. She put the clean knife into a plastic bag and carried it out to her car. She went to the washing machine and put the clothes she had worn during the attack into a cycle, adding extra soap in an effort to purge the stains. She took the taser pen back to her studio apartment and put it away. Only after she had done all this did she leave the property. She did not go to the police or a hospital or a friend's house to confess. She went shopping. Witnesses and reports later stated that she went to a local grocery store where she walked the aisles, picked up items, and met her spouse, who had been running errands. To anyone watching her in that store, she would have looked like any other woman doing her shopping on an ordinary day in Ocala. The blood on her parents' floors, the bodies in their home, did not show on her clothes. She had taken care of that. Back at the house, Richard was not dead. Gravely wounded, bleeding heavily from multiple stab wounds, he found the strength to reach a phone and call 911. The recording later played in court captured his voice, weakening but determined, as he told the dispatcher that he had been attacked by Christina with a knife. He told them his wife had been attacked too. "I'm fading fast," he said, and those words carried across the lines to dispatchers who knew every second mattered. When Marion County deputies arrived, the scene inside the house matched the gravity of the call. Blood pooled and smeared across floors and walls. Richard, 74 years old, had lost a significant amount of blood. Sally lay unconscious, her breathing shallow. The injuries to both were extensive. Paramedics worked quickly, stabilizing them for transport. Richard was rushed to hospital, but despite doctors' efforts, his wounds, especially the two that had pierced his heart, were not survivable. He died from his injuries. Sally was taken into surgery and then to intensive care, her survival uncertain but still possible. At first, Christina was nowhere to be found, as one account later put it. Deputies did not see her at the house or in the immediate area. They spread out, checking the rest of the property, then the roads, looking for her car. Not long afterwards, they located her during a traffic stop, driving back toward the scene with her spouse in the vehicle. She was calm. When questioned, she denied any involvement. She told deputies that she had spent her morning doing chores, watching movies, and going grocery shopping. Her spouse said the same, that she had just been out running errands and had not mentioned any altercation or violence at home. But detectives already knew better. They had Richard's 911 call naming his attacker. They had the scene itself, with evidence of a close-range knife attack inside the home Christina shared with her parents. As they began to search her car, the thin membrane of her story began to tear. In the vehicle, inside a plastic bag, they found the knife she had tried to wash in bleach. Back at the house, the washing machine held clothing still in a cycle, bearing traces that suggested they had recently been worn during something violent. The taser pen would be traced back to her studio. Each piece contradicted her story of an ordinary morning. When confronted with these discrepancies, between what she said and what they could see, Christina's composure began to crack. Her series of events did not match up with the statements given by her spouse, as the state attorney's office later put it. At first she tried to maintain her denial, but the evidence pushed in from all sides. Her father's words on the 911 tape, the physical evidence, the timeline. Finally, sitting with detectives, she confessed. She admitted that she had attacked both of her parents with a knife. She told them she had been angry at being told she had to leave the home she shared with them. In that confession, she detailed her preparation. She described how she changed her clothes, put on gloves and shoe covers, and armed herself with the taser pen and the 9-inch knife. She explained the sequence of the attack, the shock from the taser pen to her father, the stabbing that followed, the way her mother had entered and been stabbed in the chest. She admitted that she believed they were both dead when she left. She spoke of placing the knife in a bucket of bleach and water, putting it in a bag, changing her clothes, starting the washing machine, and going shopping. At one point, she called herself a sociopath and mentioned an undiagnosed dissociative disorder, offering a glimpse into the way she framed her own actions. The deputies and detectives listening to her knew, even as she spoke, that she had fundamentally altered not only her own life, but her parents' future and the emotional world of everyone connected to them. Christina was arrested and taken to the Marion County Jail. She was charged with first-degree premeditated murder for the killing of her father and attempted first-degree murder with a deadly weapon for the attack on her mother. She was also charged with tampering with evidence. Judge and prosecutors deemed her a danger, and she was held without bond while the case moved slowly toward trial. In the months that followed, Sally fought for her life in hospital and then began the long process of physical and emotional recovery. She had lost her husband. She had come within a knife's edge of losing her own life. And the person responsible was the daughter she had once rocked to sleep, bandaged when she fell, listened to through the dramas of childhood and adolescence. When she was strong enough, she would tell her story in court, her voice shaking as she relived the moment she walked into that room and saw her husband stabbed and her daughter turning on her with a knife. The case against Christina was, in the words of prosecutors, overwhelming. There was the 911 call, her father naming her as his attacker. There was the physical evidence in the house and car, the knife, the blood, the clothes in the washing machine. There was her own confession, recorded by investigators. And there was the clear motive she had given. She was angry at being told to move out. The Marion County Sheriff's Office summed it up starkly. Adams later told detectives that she was angry over being asked to leave the home that she shared with the victims. Adams stated she retrieved a large knife and then attacked both victims, stabbing them multiple times. In April 2025, more than 2.5 years after the attack, Christina's case went before a jury in Marion County. Assistant State Attorneys Toby Hunt and Amy Burnt prosecuted. They called multiple witnesses, neighbors, law enforcement officers, forensic experts, medical professionals, and most importantly, Sally herself. Jurors heard about Christina's preparation, her clothing, her gloves, the bleach, the washing machine. They learned that Richard had suffered 7 stab wounds, 2 of them into his heart. They heard the 911 call, an elderly man's last recorded words, naming his own daughter as the one who had stabbed him and his wife. They listened to Christina's confession, in which she outlined her steps in calm, almost detached language. Christina did not testify in her own defense. Her lawyers tried to raise questions about her mental state, suggesting that dissociation or other psychological factors could have played a role. But prosecutors countered that whatever her internal struggles, the actions she took were textbook premeditation. This was not an accident, one of them told the jury. This was a violent, deliberate act in response to being told she had to leave her parents' home. Toby Hunt described how her preparation, the dark clothing, gloves, knife, taser pen, the cleaning and disposal of evidence, the trip to the grocery store, showed calculation rather than sudden loss of control. After hearing all the evidence, jurors retired to deliberate. They did not need long. According to the 5th Judicial Circuit State Attorney's Office, their discussions were brief. When they returned to the courtroom, the verdicts came one after another. Guilty of premeditated murder in the first degree for the killing of her father. Guilty of attempted first-degree murder with a deadly weapon for the attack on her mother. On April 16, 2025, Judge Timothy McCourt sentenced Christina and Adams. For the murder of Richard Langer and the attempted murder of Sally, he imposed 2 life sentences. In some accounts, they were described as consecutive terms, one for each parent, stacked end to end, ensuring she would never again be free. The state attorney's office announced the sentencing the following day, noting that justice had been secured through compelling witness testimony and irrefutable evidence. For Sally, the sentence was a recognition of what she had survived and lost. She would live out the rest of her life carrying scars from the knife wounds and from the knowledge of who had wielded the blade. She had to bury her husband, navigate the financial and practical consequences of losing him, and brace herself against the echoes of his last words. The daughter she had once protected was now shackled in a courtroom, condemned by her own choices. In the community around Leeward Air Ranch, the case left a lasting mark. Neighbors who had waved to Richard and Sally, who had perhaps seen Christina walking between the studio and the main house, struggled to reconcile their memories with what they now knew. A simple family dispute over living arrangements, something that happens in countless homes as adult children and parents negotiate space and responsibility, had escalated into a scene of blood and emergency sirens. The story of Christina and Adams is, at its core, a story about how ordinary frustrations and unresolved anger can, under the wrong conditions, metastasize into something monstrous. The request that she move out was not a violent act. It was a boundary set by parents who had already given years of support. Christina's response, to plan an attack, arm herself, stab both parents, destroy evidence, and then act as though nothing had happened, transformed that boundary into a pretext for murder. It is also a story about the fragility of trust within a family. For Richard and Sally, allowing their daughter to live on their property meant believing she would not harm them. The home was meant to be a place where they could age with some peace, surrounded by those they loved. In a single morning, that trust was shattered. The very person they had tried to help became the source of the violence that ended one life and nearly ended another. In prison, Christina will have decades to revisit the choices she made on that September day. The moment in the studio when anger hardened into intent. The walk back to the house with a knife and taser pen in her hands. The split seconds in which she drove the blade into the bodies of the two people who had given her life. Outside those walls, the people who loved Richard and Sally live with their own unending replay. A father's last phone call, a mother's memory of her daughter's face at the moment of betrayal, a house that will never again be just a house. Nothing in the court sentence can restore what was taken. 2 life terms can only mark, in the language of law, the depth of the harm done. But in telling the story of what happened in that Florida home, the long simmering tensions, the decision that pushed a daughter to pick up a knife, the desperate 911 call that named her, the slow work of investigators piecing together the truth, there is at least a record. It stands as a stark reminder of how quickly the bonds that hold a family together can be severed when rage is allowed to eclipse everything else. Story 5. On the morning of May 8, 2008, the sky over Woodland Park, Colorado was a pale, gentle blue, the kind that made the thin mountain air feel almost forgiving. The Maddox house sat among tall pines, the trunks straight and solemn, like sentinels around the quiet residential street. Inside that house, 18-year-old Joshua Vernon Maddox laced up his shoes, the same way he had done countless times before, getting ready to go out for a walk. He told his sister he was heading out and that he would be back soon. It was nothing unusual. Josh loved the outdoors, loved slipping away into the trees just beyond their neighborhood, where the crunch of pine needles muffled the world and heavy thoughts could blow away on the wind. He had always been that way, quiet, gentle, thoughtful, someone who seemed to move more slowly than the rest of the world, as if he were listening for something other people couldn't hear. He stepped through the front door and closed it behind him. The sound echoed once in the hallway. Then it was gone, swallowed by the soft hush of the woods and the distant murmur of a small mountain town going about its day. Joshua Maddox never came home. In the first days after his disappearance, the Maddox family tried to hold on to the belief that this was a misunderstanding that could somehow still be corrected. Woodland Park was not a big city. It was a close community of little houses, local shops, and winding roads bordered by forest. It was the kind of place where people noticed when something was out of place, when a familiar face didn't appear where it usually did. Joshua was well liked. He played guitar and wrote music, often drifting between the trees with his instrument, looking for a quiet spot where he could sit and let melodies spill out of him. He had friends, a family who loved him, and a reputation for being calm and kind, even as he wrestled with a deep sadness that had settled into the house 2 years earlier. In 2006, Joshua's older brother, Zachary, had died by suicide. The loss cut into the family like a sharp winter wind that never quite left, no matter how many seasons passed. Joshua especially seemed marked by it. He became quieter, more introspective, sometimes drifting off into his own thoughts for long stretches. Yet he was not known to be reckless. and nothing in his behavior suggested that he was planning to run away. When he did not return that day, his family waited, trying to give him the benefit of time. Maybe he had gone to a friend's house. Maybe he had wandered deeper into the woods and lost track of the light. The hours stretched on, and the house grew too quiet. Night came, and still Joshua did not come back. Eventually, the lingering hope hardened into one simple, terrible fact: he was missing. The search for Joshua began with the kind of urgency that only small communities can muster. Relatives, neighbors, and local officers scoured the nearby trails and wooded areas that he loved so much. People called out his name into the trees, their voices meeting only the whisper of the wind through the branches. Flyers with his photograph, a tall, slim teenager with long hair and a gentle, almost shy smile, were taped to windows and nailed to bulletin boards. Police tried to piece together his last known movements. They learned he had simply told his sister he was going for a walk. He had not taken a backpack or supplies, nothing that suggested planning or a long journey. There were no signs of a struggle near the house, no dropped belongings, no sudden, obvious clue pointing to what had happened once he stepped off the property and onto the street. The sheriff's office and local agencies followed up on leads that trickled in over time. Possible sightings, vague rumors, but each one dissolved under scrutiny. As the days turned into weeks, the boundaries of the searches expanded beyond Woodland Park into the surrounding areas, then into other towns. Nothing appeared. In the quiet hours at home, his father and sisters were forced to confront the absence in the only ways they could. There were nights when the small details hurt the most. A half-finished song he had been working on, a favorite chair left empty, the way his room seemed to wait for him untouched. Some relatives wondered whether Joshua, still grieving his brother, might have chosen to leave and start over somewhere else. It was a possibility the family considered, not because they truly believed he had abandoned them, but because it at least allowed room for the thought that he might still be alive somewhere, walking unknown streets under an unfamiliar sky. Yet nothing surfaced, no calls, no letters, no evidence of a new life being lived far away. The case slowly cooled. Joshua Maddox moved from a name on people's lips to a photograph on missing person databases. For the public, he became one more unresolved absence. For his family, he remained a presence that haunted every ordinary day. Just a short distance from the Maddox house, less than a mile away, an old cabin stood at the edge of Woodland Park, its roof sagging under the weight of time and snow. The structure had once been a gathering place, a family cabin, but by 2008 it had already begun to slip quietly into disuse. The cabin belonged to a local man named Chuck Murphy, a property owner and developer. He had purchased the land years earlier, and as the town slowly grew, began to see it less as a retreat and more as a site waiting for a new purpose. But the cabin itself remained, aging in place. Over time, it became a problem. Teenagers sneaked onto the property and into the cabin to drink, party, or simply poke around the ruins of someone else's memories. Animals found their way in. Windows were broken. The building, once warm and inviting, turned into something darker, rotting timbers, damp floors, garbage scattered across the interior. Murphy tried to secure it. He nailed the doors shut, boarded the windows, and locked what he could. At one point, concerned about animals entering through the chimney, he installed a heavy metal grate and rebar beneath the top layer of bricks to block access from above. Inside the cabin, furniture was moved and stacked in front of the fireplace, further closing off that route. Years passed. The cabin decayed a little more with each winter. Then, in 2015, Murphy finally moved forward with plans to demolish it and build 32 new family homes on the property. The cabin would be knocked down, the land cleared, and the old structure's long, slow decline would officially end. In early August, as the demolition date approached, Murphy noticed an unpleasant odor around the cabin, a stench that lingered without a clear source. Given the building's state and the history of animals getting inside, he assumed that some creature had died within the walls or chimney, leaving its remains hidden somewhere behind wood and brick. He would learn how wrong he was. On August 7, 2015, a demolition crew arrived to begin tearing down the cabin. The day was routine at first. Machines moved in, boards splintered, glass fell, and the old building, so much a part of the landscape for years, started to collapse under the force of steel and diesel engines. 2 workers were inside when they began dismantling the chimney, working from the top down. As bricks came loose and rubble fell away, they reached deeper into the structure. In that moment, amidst dust and debris, they saw something that did not belong. A shape pressed into the narrow, hidden throat of the chimney. It was a body. The workers stopped. Shock froze them where they stood as the realization spread through the crew, and then to Chuck Murphy, who had come to the site that day. He called the authorities immediately. When law enforcement and the county coroner's office arrived, they found a mummified body compressed within the brickwork, crammed into a fetal position with the legs bent above the head. The remains were lodged inside the chimney itself, not lying in the fireplace below. The person was naked except for a thin thermal shirt. Nearby, inside the cabin, not inside the chimney, someone found clothing that appeared to have been neatly folded and placed within the structure, as if set aside. The juxtaposition was strange and unsettling. A body trapped in a narrow shaft, stripped almost completely, while clothes rested undisturbed elsewhere in the dark, decaying room. The remains were sent for examination and identification. Through dental records and distinctive physical evidence, they were soon matched to an 18-year-old who had vanished from Woodland Park 7 years earlier. It was Joshua Maddox. For the Maddox family, the call that came in 2015 delivered the kind of answer no one ever wants. For 7 years, they had lived in a suspended state, held between hope and grief, imagining their son and brother might be alive somewhere. Now they were told that he had been found dead inside a chimney, in an abandoned cabin just 2 blocks from their home. The shock was profound. The idea that Joshua had been right there, so close all that time, trapped inside a place no one thought to look, was almost unbearable. In public, the case moved quickly from miraculous discovery to troubling mystery. Dr. Al Bourne, the Teller County coroner, conducted an autopsy and reported that there were no signs of trauma on Joshua's bones. There were no fractures, no marks from weapons, no bullet holes, no evidence of rope or tape. The soot in the fireplace reportedly showed no disturbance that would suggest a struggle. The body was so decomposed, essentially mummified by the dry environment, that determining an exact cause of death was not straightforward. Toxicology was impossible. However, Bourne believed he could estimate the time Joshua entered the chimney based on the condition of the remains and the history of the cabin. The coroner concluded that Joshua had likely been inside the chimney for around 7 years, going back to the time of his disappearance in May 2008. Bourne put forward a theory. On September 28, 2015, his office formally ruled Joshua's death an accident. He suggested that Joshua had voluntarily climbed into the chimney, perhaps to gain access to the cabin, and then become trapped. According to Bourne, the most likely cause of death was hypothermia. In early May, temperatures in Woodland Park at night could drop into the high 20s Fahrenheit, well below freezing, particularly in the higher, thinner air of the region. It was a simple explanation on the surface, a tragic misadventure. A young man, maybe curious, maybe seeking shelter or a way into an abandoned place, climbs down a chimney and gets stuck. Unable to free himself, he succumbs to cold and time. But for many people, including Chuck Murphy, the man who owned the cabin where Joshua's body was found, that explanation did not fit what they knew. Murphy had lived with that cabin for years. He knew its structure, its quirks, the changes he had made to keep animals and intruders out. When he heard the coroner's conclusion, that Joshua had climbed down the chimney voluntarily in 2008, he was deeply troubled. There was, he insisted, a fundamental problem. The chimney was not easily accessible from above. To keep raccoons and other wildlife out, Murphy said he had installed a metal grate with rebar under the uppermost layer of bricks, effectively sealing the passage from the top. For a person to climb down from the roof, they would have had to bypass or break that barrier. Yet as far as he knew, the grate remained in place until the demolition, and there were no clear indications that it had been torn out or destroyed years earlier. Murphy also pointed to the condition inside the cabin. Furniture had been stacked in front of the fireplace, blocking access from the room into the chimney. If Joshua had somehow entered from inside the cabin and climbed up, the placement of the furniture suggested someone had moved it intentionally to obstruct that route. Taken together, these details made the notion of a simple accident feel increasingly fragile. Murphy felt excluded from the investigation. He later said that the coroner's office had not fully consulted him about the cabin's history or structure before reaching the accidental death ruling. When he realized what the official narrative was going to be, he contacted Bourne and asked to meet. On October 3, 2015, the two men spoke for hours, debating their perspectives. Bourne maintained that there was no evidence of homicide, no injuries, no bindings, no clear indication that another person had attacked Joshua. He acknowledged that certain details were strange, including the furniture in front of the fireplace, but argued that they could not be definitively linked to foul play. Murphy, however, remained unconvinced. To him, the combination of a sealed chimney top, blocked fireplace, and the state of Joshua's body made an accident feel not just unlikely, but almost impossible. He did not claim to know what had happened, but he could not accept the idea that Joshua had simply tried to enter the cabin in such a bizarre way and become trapped on his own. The coroner's ruling carried legal consequences. By labeling Joshua's death an accident, Bourne effectively placed the case fully under the jurisdiction of the coroner's office, preventing law enforcement from treating it as a potential homicide investigation. An undetermined ruling or a classification as a suspicious death would have left more room for police to pursue additional leads. Instead, the official line remained that Joshua had died alone in the chimney, the victim of his own miscalculation and the unforgiving cold. Yet outside of the official paperwork, questions multiplied. Those questions spread far beyond Woodland Park. As true crime writers, podcasters, and online communities began to examine Joshua's case, the unusual nature of his death drew intense attention. People picked apart every known detail: his character, his last day, the state of the cabin, the position of his body, the coroner's statements, and the doubts expressed by Chuck Murphy. One of the most disturbing details was Joshua's condition when found. His body was wedged into the narrow shaft, bent in a cramped position with his legs above his head. He wore only a thin shirt. The rest of his clothing was not tangled around him, not hanging in shreds or bunched beneath him, but reportedly folded and placed inside the cabin. If Joshua had climbed into the chimney himself from the top, it meant that he would have had to remove his clothes either before entering or while stuck in the cramped space, then somehow deposit them inside the cabin. If he had entered from inside, then the presence of folded clothes elsewhere suggested deliberate action either by him or someone else. To many observers, neither scenario made easy sense. In conditions of hypothermia, people can sometimes experience what is known as paradoxical undressing, where they feel a burning sensation of heat and remove their clothing even as their body temperature drops. This behavior has been documented in some cold weather deaths. However, this explanation still struggled against the specifics of Joshua's case: the tight space of the chimney, the folded clothing, and the blocked entrances. There were also the whispers of another, darker possibility, that Joshua had not entered the chimney alone. In the years after Joshua disappeared, another young man from Woodland Park drew attention for reasons that were far more violent. His name was Andy, someone who had once moved in the same circles, at least on the edges of local friendships and acquaintances. In some accounts, he and Joshua had been seen together shortly before Joshua vanished. According to discussions that later surfaced online, Andy left Colorado and ended up in New Mexico, where he became involved in a brutal crime. He reportedly visited the apartment of a disabled man, and when the caretaker returned from taking a shower, he found the disabled man stabbed to death and Andy gone. When Andy was eventually arrested, he allegedly claimed responsibility not only for that killing, but also for another woman's death in Taos, saying he had hidden her body in a barrel. His criminal record grew. Over time, He faced charges in multiple states and spent years in prison or secure facilities. At one point, he was charged with murder, but the case was dropped when a crucial witness died, leaving prosecutors without enough evidence to continue. Rumors began to link him, at least in the public imagination, to Joshua's fate. Anonymous posters claimed that Andy had bragged about putting Josh in a hole. The phrase was vague yet chilling, a cruel joke or an admission, depending on how one chose to hear it. Teller County Coroner Al Bourne acknowledged that investigators had looked at a suspect with a long criminal history, a man who had lived a transient lifestyle and served time in Portland, Seattle, Texas, and other places, but he said they could not place him in Woodland Park at the time of Joshua's disappearance. Without that link, and with no physical evidence tying anyone else to Joshua's body or the cabin, the suspect was discounted. It was a tangle of suggestion and absence. There was just enough to disturb the imagination, but not enough to stand up in court. Officially, no one was charged in connection with Joshua's death. Meanwhile, the cabin that had hidden his body was destroyed. The demolition, which had been paused when the remains were discovered, resumed after the investigation at the site was declared complete. By September 30th, 2015, the cabin was gone, leaving only dust, open space, and the plans for new houses that would eventually rise where it had once stood. Joshua's body was cremated. In life, he had loved quiet places, the feel of the woods around him, the sound of his guitar echoing softly off trees and walls. In death, he was reduced to reports, timelines, and the lingering ache of a story that refused to resolve. The coroner, speaking at a press conference, admitted that there were elements of the case that defied explanation. There are going to be some questions that are unanswerable, he said. It was a rare acknowledgement of the limits of official certainty, but it came alongside his firm decision to classify the death as accidental. For Chuck Murphy, the decision felt like a door closing on a case that still needed to be held open. For Joshua's family, it may have offered some type of conclusion, at least on paper, but it could not solve the deeper mystery. How had Joshua, a thoughtful, careful 18-year-old, ended up wedged inside a chimney in a cabin just down the road from his home? The questions hung over Woodland Park long after the machines and workers had gone. To understand the emotional weight of Joshua's story, it is important to remember who he was before he became a subject of speculation and debate. He was not a puzzle before he vanished. He was a person. Friends remembered him as a kind, soft-spoken teenager who loved music and the outdoors. He wrote songs and played guitar, his long hair falling over his face as he concentrated on chords and lyrics. He was gentle with younger kids and affectionate with his family, a steady presence in a house that had already known heartbreak. The grief he carried after Zachary's death was real and heavy, yet those close to him did not see signs that he wanted to die. Instead, they saw a young man trying to navigate sadness, searching for moments of peace among the trees and in the quiet corners where his music could fill the silence. In some ways, the woods around Woodland Park were an extension of him. When he stepped outside on May 8, 2008, for what he said would be a short walk, it was easy to imagine him following familiar paths, listening to the sound of his own footsteps, letting the cool air clear his mind. That image, Josh moving through the pines with his hands in his pockets and his thoughts turned inward, became, for his family, both a source of comfort and pain. They had to live for years with unanswered questions, with empty chairs at holidays and the quiet ache of birthdays that were marked without him. When they finally learned what had happened, they had to integrate a new, more horrifying picture. Their son and brother trapped, alone in a narrow, lightless shaft, calling out for help that never came, or perhaps slipping away silently without a chance to call at all. The emotional impact of that realization is hard to fully articulate. It is a grief layered with images no one should have to hold in their mind. For the community, Joshua's case became something like a wound that never quite healed. Many residents had searched for him. Others had driven past the decaying cabin countless times, never knowing that a missing boy was sealed inside its chimney. Even after the official conclusion was delivered, people continued to talk about the case, at kitchen tables, in coffee shops, and online. Dark histories and other in-depth sources pointed out the inconsistencies that troubled them. The blocked fireplace, the grate and rebar on the chimney, the folded clothes, and the lack of clear investigation into certain leads. They noted that the coroner did, at one point, reopen the case after speaking with Chuck Murphy, acknowledging that there were reasons to doubt his initial conclusion. Yet even then, the ultimate classification did not change. The result is a narrative that never settles. On one side, there is an official record that says Joshua's death was an accident, likely caused by hypothermia after he voluntarily entered a chimney and became trapped. On the other, there is a constellation of facts and impressions that make that explanation feel incomplete to many who study the case. The truth, whatever it is, lies somewhere in the narrow space between these versions, a space as confined and difficult to access as the chimney where Joshua died. Yet beneath all the speculation, one reality remains unchanged. An 18-year-old young man who loved music and the outdoors left his house one spring morning and never returned. He ended up trapped inside a chimney in a decaying cabin just down the road, and no one knew he was there for 7 years. The details of how he got there, who, if anyone, helped put him there, and what he experienced in his final moments may never be fully known. For his family and for many who have come to care about his story, that is the most painful element of all. Not only the loss, but the silence that surrounds it. There is a particular kind of sorrow that comes from an unresolved story. It lingers in the spaces where answers should be, in the pauses between facts. Joshua's life, brief as it was, touched others with its quiet warmth. His death, with all its unanswered questions, continues to touch people in a different way, as a reminder of how fragile safety can be, how quickly familiarity can turn into strangeness, and how sometimes, even when a case is closed, the truth still feels just out of reach. Somewhere in Woodland Park, children who weren't yet born when Joshua disappeared now walk past the place where the cabin once stood, unaware of the history beneath their feet. The pines still stand, tall and watchful, the air still thins at altitude, and the town goes on. But for those who remember Joshua Maddox, the boy who went for a walk and never came home, the young man later found in a chimney under circumstances that defy simple explanation, there is a quiet, enduring wish that someday, somehow, the questions will finally be answered. Story 6. In the bustling heart of Fort Lauderdale, where the sun-kissed beaches met the relentless hum of urban ambition, Anna Maria Nezevich now had built a life that seemed, from the outside, like a dream woven from determination and love. Born in Colombia, she had crossed oceans to chase the promise of America, becoming a naturalized citizen with a spirit as vibrant as the tropical landscapes she left behind. At 40, Anna was a woman of quiet strength, her dark hair framing a face that often lit up with a warm, infectious smile. Friends described her as caring, funny, and adventurous, a soul who found joy in simple things, like a shared laugh over coffee or a spontaneous walk along the shore. But beneath that warmth lay a resilience forged from life's harder edges, a resilience that had carried her through 13 years of marriage to David Nezevich, a man whose own journey from Serbia to the United States mirrored her immigrant story in ambition, if not in heart. David, 36 when their paths first diverged irreparably, was a businessman with a sharp mind for technology and real estate. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a gaze that could shift from charming to intense in a heartbeat, he had arrived in America seeking opportunity, much like Anna. They met in the mid-2000s, drawn together by shared experiences of building new lives in a foreign land. Their marriage, sealed in 2011, blossomed into a partnership that amassed a small fortune, millions in Broward County properties, tech ventures, and the kind of stability that many envied. But as the years wore on, cracks appeared. What began as minor disagreements over finances escalated into a chasm, fueled by differing visions of the future. Anna dreamed of something more than material success. She yearned for purpose, perhaps even starting a non-profit to help women escaping abuse. A cause close to her heart given the stories she'd heard from friends, and her own subtle intuitions about power imbalances in relationships. By late 2023, the marriage had unraveled into a bitter divorce. The proceedings were messy, entangled in disputes over their substantial assets, homes, investments, a life built brick by brick that now felt like a battlefield. Anna, feeling the weight of it all, decided she needed space. In December 2023, she packed her bags and flew to Madrid, Spain, a city that promised reinvention. It was a place of ancient streets and modern energy, where she could breathe freely, away from the legal wrangling and emotional strain. She rented a modest apartment in the upscale Salamanca district, a neighborhood of elegant buildings and lively cafes, hoping to heal and plan her next chapter. Her family, brother Felipe and mother Ora back in Florida, supported her decision, though they worried about her being alone so far from home. "Take care of yourself," Felipe had said during their last video call, his voice laced with the protective concern of a sibling who knew her vulnerabilities. Madrid welcomed Anna with its winter chill, but she embraced it. She wandered the cobblestone alleys, sipped café con leche in quaint bistros, and reconnected with old friends. One of them, Sana Ramo, a close confidant, remembered Anna's messages filled with optimism. Plans for the non-profit, excitement about exploring Europe, and a quiet resolve to move forward. But as January turned to February, subtle shadows began to creep in. Anna confided in Sana about the ongoing divorce tensions, David's reluctance to divide their assets fairly, his messages that oscillated between pleas and demands. Still, she seemed determined, her voice steady over the phone lines that bridged continents. On February 2nd, 2024, the day that would shatter everything, Anna's apartment building stood quiet under the gray Spanish sky. The structure was modern, with secure elevators and surveillance cameras that promised safety. Around 5 p.m., a man entered the lobby, his face obscured by a motorcycle helmet, black and unremarkable yet ominous in its anonymity. He moved with purpose, carrying a can of spray paint. In a matter of moments, he reached up and coated the lens of the security camera, blinding it to what would unfold next. The building's residents went about their evenings unaware, but this intruder slipped into the elevator, ascending to Anna's floor. What happened in those hidden minutes remains a void in the narrative, a black hole of uncertainty that investigators would later piece together with fragments of evidence. Anna, alone in her apartment, might have been preparing for a quiet night, perhaps scrolling through photos of her family or jotting notes for her non-profit dreams. Did she hear the knock? Did she sense the danger before it materialized? The man, prosecutors would later allege, was no stranger. He was David, her estranged husband, driven by a toxic brew of possession and desperation. But in that moment, as the door opened or was forced, the air thickened with unspoken dread. An hour later, the helmeted figure reemerged from the elevator, now wheeling a large suitcase behind him. It was bulky, heavy, the kind that might contain a life's worth of belongings, or something far more sinister. He exited the building, vanishing into the Madrid dusk, leaving behind an apartment that, when later examined, showed no overt signs of violence. No blood, no disarray, just an eerie silence where Anna's presence had been erased. The next morning, February 3rd, strange messages began arriving on the phones of Anna's friends. They were in Spanish, purportedly from her, but laced with awkward phrasing that didn't sound like the woman they knew. "I met someone wonderful," one read. "He has a summer house about 2h from Madrid. We're going there now, and I will spend a few days there. Signal is spotty. I'll call you when I get back. Kisses." Sana read it with a knot in her stomach. It was too abrupt, too unlike Anna, who was cautious and communicative, especially during her divorce. Another friend received a similar text, claiming Anna had run off with a new man for a romantic getaway. Alarm bells rang. This wasn't the Anna who valued her independence and shared her plans meticulously. Back in Florida, Felipe now felt the first pangs of worry when he couldn't reach his sister. Calls went unanswered, messages unread. By February 5th, with no word, he contacted Spanish authorities, reporting Anna missing. The national police launched an investigation, combing her apartment for clues. They found her belongings intact: passport, clothes, personal items, suggesting she hadn't left voluntarily. The spray-painted camera raised suspicions of foul play, and surveillance footage from nearby streets captured glimpses of a Peugeot 308 with tinted windows and suspicious license plates speeding away from the city. As days turned to weeks, the case drew international attention. Billboards in Madrid pleaded for information, Anna's smiling face gazing out over the traffic. Her family, devastated, clung to hope. "We still believe she could be alive," Felipe told reporters, his voice cracking with emotion. Aura, Anna's mother, spent sleepless nights praying, her heart heavy with the unimaginable. Friends like Sana rallied, organizing searches and media appeals. Their grief mingled with frustration at the slow grind of cross-border bureaucracy. Meanwhile, David Nezovich remained in Serbia, where he had family ties. He claimed innocence from afar, insisting he was over 1,600 miles away when Anna vanished. But investigators were building a case, thread by thread. They traced his movements: a flight from Miami to Istanbul on January 27th, then to Belgrade, Serbia. There, on January 29th, he rented a Peugeot 308 from a local agency. The car, when returned weeks later on March 17th, had clocked nearly 4,800 extra miles, enough for a round trip to Madrid and back. The windows were newly tinted, stickers removed, and the license plates had been swapped with stolen ones, recovered later near a motorcycle shop where a helmet matching the intruder's had been purchased. More damning were the purchases. On the day of Anna's disappearance, security cameras at a Madrid hardware store captured a man resembling David buying duct tape and spray paint, the same brand used on the apartment camera. Prosecutors alleged he used these to facilitate the abduction, perhaps to bind or silence, though no direct evidence of violence emerged. Then there were the texts. Investigators discovered David had contacted a Colombian woman he met on a dating app, asking her to translate English phrases into perfect Colombian Spanish. The messages matched those sent to Anna's friends, a clumsy attempt to create an alibi of a voluntary disappearance. The motive loomed large: the divorce. Anna and David were locked in a battle over their $3.4 million in assets, including mortgage notes and properties. Anna had expressed fears to friends about David's controlling nature, his unwillingness to let go. "He doesn't want to divide things fairly," she had confided. In the weeks before her trip, tensions escalated. David had allegedly tried to access her financial accounts, even asking an employee to impersonate her to open a new bank account using her social security number. The employee refused, uncomfortable with the request. By May 2024, the net tightened. David flew back to Miami International Airport from Serbia, where FBI agents arrested him on charges of kidnapping. He pleaded not guilty, his attorney Jane Weintraub decrying the case as circumstantial, built on assumptions without a body or direct proof. "There's no evidence he harmed her," she argued in court. But Magistrate Judge Edwin Torres, reviewing the evidence, deemed David a flight risk and ordered him held without bond. "The cunning level of deception," Torres noted, pointing to the fake texts and altered rental car, painted a picture of premeditation. Anna's family, gathered in Florida, felt a mix of relief and anguish. "This is a step toward justice," Felipe said, his eyes shadowed by grief. They filed a wrongful death lawsuit against David, his brother, and others, alleging conspiracy and fraudulent transfers that hid assets. The suit named attorneys and firms involved in the divorce, claiming they aided in a plot that culminated in murder. "We want accountability," their lawyer Adam Ingber stated, as the family navigated the legal maze, their hope for Anna's return fading into a quest for closure. As summer turned to fall, the investigation deepened. In August 2024, FBI agents joined Spanish and Italian authorities in searching woods north of Vicenza, Italy, following a GPS ping from David's rental car suggesting a detour on his return to Serbia. They combed the underbrush, hoping for traces of Anna, but found nothing. The absence of her body haunted the case, a ghostly reminder of unresolved pain. In November 2024, a federal grand jury in Miami escalated the charges. kidnapping resulting in death, foreign domestic violence resulting in death, and foreign murder of a U.S. national. The indictment accused David of traveling to Spain with the intent to kill, injure, harass, and intimidate, acting with premeditation. If convicted, he faced life in prison or even the death penalty. Prosecutors painted a portrait of a man consumed by control, who flew to Turkey, then Serbia, rented the car, and drove to Madrid to confront Anna amid their divorce war. He seized, confined, kidnapped, and carried her away, the documents stated, alleging he left with her in that suitcase, her fate sealed in silence. David's team fought back. "This is a desperate attempt without evidence," Weintraub declared. He pleaded not guilty again in December, maintaining his innocence from the federal detention center in Miami. The trial was tentatively set for February 2025, but delays loomed as both sides prepared. Anna's family, meanwhile, mourned publicly. "We're trying to honor her memory," Felipe said, his voice steady but laced with sorrow. Ora spoke of the love that sustained them, the friends who rallied, even as the void of Anna's absence grew. But the story took a tragic turn on April 28, 2025. In the dim light of early morning, prison staff at the Federal Detention Center found David unresponsive in his cell. Emergency measures failed. He was pronounced dead, an apparent suicide at 37. His lawyers expressed devastation, calling for a thorough investigation. For Anna's family, it was a cruel blow. No trial, no confession, no final answers. "This is the ultimate insult," Felipe lamented, the weight of unresolved grief pressing down. In the aftermath, the case lingered like an unfinished symphony. Anna's body remained unfound, her dreams of helping abused women unfulfilled. Her story, pieced from fragments of evidence and heartache, served as a stark reminder of hidden dangers in fractured relationships. Friends remembered her laughter, family her strength, and the world pondered the shadows that can eclipse even the brightest lives. The tension of her disappearance, the stakes of justice denied, and the human impact echoed on, a narrative of loss that demanded reflection on love, control, and the fragile threads binding us all.